Have you ever looked at a DIY project and then immediately talked yourself out of it like, oh, there's no way I could do that? Well, same. And that's why you want to watch this, because if I can do it, so can you. Today, I'm really excited to be sharing with you my most challenging DIY to date, tiling this entire kitchen with absolutely zero previous experience. If you're a beginner hoping to have a go at tiling, or you just like a laugh at someone bumbling through a tough project, then this one's for you. If you're new here, my name's Em, and this is where I share all of my colourful home decor ideas, bodge through DIY challenges, and help you to make your home a more fun, happy place. In this video, I'm going to take you through the whole tiling process, sharing my honest thoughts and feelings so you know exactly what it's like to try tiling for the first time. Spoiler alert, it's actually quite fun. So I knew I wanted a pink tile, but not too pink. I went with this lovely coral from Tile Joint. They're all a slightly different shade from each other, so they produce this wonderful effect when you line them all up. If you're choosing tiles, they are a bit more permanent than paint, so while I'd never recommend playing it safe because boring, do think carefully about picking a colour you know you love. For me, pink is my neutral, it runs throughout my house, and I know that I'm not going to get bored of it anytime soon. Something else to consider is the shape of your tiles and how you want to lay them out. I've gone for a fairly basic rectangular metro style. I do love those hexagonal ones. Have you seen those almost scalloped shell-like ones? They're absolutely beautiful, but to be honest, I didn't back myself to lay and cut those. A simpler shape will be easier to do a good DIY job with, so bear that in mind when you're picking. A simple shaped tile doesn't have to mean a boring layout though. Consider the kind of pattern that you want to make on the wall. I decided to lay my tiles vertically, kind of just because I like to be contrary, but also because it lifts the eye upwards and makes the room feel more spacious. So, I've got my tiles. That was the easy part. Turns out you also need a whole bunch of other stuff. This was the part where I started to feel a bit daunted when all this unfamiliar kit turned up and I was like, what have I got myself into here? I got a laser level to make sure my tiles were lined up straight, tile spaces to go in between, a big bucket of pre-mixed adhesive and a trowel to get it on the wall, grout, trim, and a big old bucket to mix the grout together. My biggest purchase that I made for this project was the tile cutter. There are so many different types at so many different price points, I really had to think carefully about what would be right for my project. If you're doing a small area with basic metro tiles, a cheap tile snapper should do the job fine. These work by scoring along the tile, allowing you to then snap it in half manually. As I was doing my whole room, I thought that something with a bit more oomph would really help to speed things up a bit. So I went to have a look at some electric tile cutters. I ended up going with a wet tile cutter, as these are really good for little precision cuts that, with the number of plug sockets in this kitchen, I think I was gonna need. Anyone else's new build go really overboard on the plug sockets because they're literally everywhere in this place. The best bang for my buck was this one for 50 quid from Screwfix. Look at me all optimistic with my big ass machine. Actually, it turns out that using the tile cutter was one of the hardest parts of the whole project. It was loud, it was wet, I started off breaking every single tile, and I really was worried that I wasn't going to be able to complete the project. But after a little bit of a wobble, I did keep going and slowly but surely stopped breaking every single tile that I tried to cut. Here's a few tips I picked up on how to use it. You set the size you want using this bit. Hold your tile up against it, maintain the pressure and slide it through the blade. Hold your nerve, the blade is not actually sharp. It grinds the tile down rather than slicing it, so it's not going to take your fingers off. If you only listen to one tip, make it this one. You need to move the tile through really slowly. Patience is completely not my strong point, so I was just trying to whiz through them all, but I was going too fast, overheating the blade and snapping all of my beautiful tiles. Also, I know it sounds stupid, but I totally didn't think about just how wet my wet tile cutter would actually be. Like, I know the water is there to cool the blade, but I got soaked doing this thing. To be honest, I should probably recommend using your tile cutter outside, but I'm not going to do that because I know you don't have enough time to keep going in and out every time you need to cut something. I certainly didn't. Just wear grotty clothes, get all your manky old towels out and do your best to contain the splashes. In terms of actually getting the tiles on the wall, this was the easy part after mastering the cutting. This bit was really fun. You just slap some adhesive on, whack a tile on top, and repeat. In terms of how much adhesive to use, you'll get a feel for this as you go along. I had a bit too much, then a bit too little, but I worked it out as I went through the process. You want enough to get a good thickness behind, but not so much that it squeezes out the edges if you start to apply pressure to the tile. The adhesive dries out, so you want to work in sections rather than slathering the whole wall before you start putting tiles on. It's not that quick though, so don't panic. You can still maneuver your tiles for quite a long time after you've placed them. For the hard to reach sections, I sometimes found it easier to put the adhesive directly onto the tile and then just stick it on, rather than trying to get the trowel into all the gaps. The tile spacers do what they say on the tin, make sure your tiles are evenly spaced. I didn't manage to use them on every single one, whether that's because my walls are wonky or I just measured really badly, I don't know. But if you don't have them on every single one, you really won't notice at the end, I promise. Just make sure the spacers are pushed back against the wall so there's room to cover them up with grout at the end. To get around corners and plug sockets, some of the tiles needed slightly more complex cuts than just a straight line. This is where my tile cutter really came in handy, and I saved those jobs for when I'd gained confidence a little bit. For plug sockets, you want to make sure that the tile sits behind the socket, but not so far in that it gets in the way of the screws and the hardware. You might need a little bit of trial and error, but I found my tile cutter was really good for just shaving off those extra bits. I'm not sure that a manual tile snapper would have been able to do that. A little word of warning to pay attention to the overall pattern when you're going around obstacles, because I did not. I totally didn't realise that I'd cut the edge off of this tile until it was a bit late and I was already on the next row up. I had to pull a few of the tiles off and then cut all the tiles above it to this weird thickness to avoid totally ruining the pattern. I don't think it's that obvious now, but might have not occurred if I was not doing this job at 1 o'clock in the morning. What do you do when you reach the top of where you want your tiles to be, but there's no kitchen cabinet in the way? I totally didn't think about this one until halfway through, so dashed out to quickly go and learn what tile trim was. Tile trim sits behind the tile and gives you a nice flat edge and a really professional finish. There are different shapes and colours to choose from. I went for this shiny silver flat one to match the other chrome that we have in the kitchen. I put it all along the hob area and it looks so smart. The thing that really stumped me for ages was the window. How was I meant to cut the trim to exactly 45 degrees so it sat neatly around the corner? First I tried a coping saw. This worked fine for straight cuts, I used it for the piece for the hob, but it wasn't precise enough for my corners. I ruined a good few bits of trim trying to get this right. So I bought a miter box to try and get those 45 degrees perfectly right. However, the saw that came with this was completely useless at cutting through the metal, and my coping saw was too small to fit in the box, so that one didn't work either. Finally, I bought a hacksaw, and this was the answer. It's actually quite hilarious that over the course of this project, I've now developed quite an impressive personal collection of saws. The hacksaw in combination with the miter box was exactly what I needed. The saw fit into the grooves and I was able to cut perfectly neat 45-degree angles, so my trim fit perfectly around the windows. Once all of the trim fiasco was over and all the tiles were up, it was time to fill in the gaps. This step was super satisfying. First I had to mix the grout up, which basically felt like I was a kid making potions in the garden. Very fun. Just look at the packet to see how much water you need. Then I just whacked the grout onto the tiles and squeezed it all into the gaps. You want to work in a diagonal motion here so that you don't squeeze it all out again when you hit the join. It's actually way harder than it looks doing this. My arms were absolutely killing me, but it was also one of the most satisfying steps of the project. It's where I really started to see things coming to life and it's starting to look a little bit finished. I just went out the room and came back in, and coming in you just see how it all looks really proper, and that's really exciting. To finish it off, I sealed all the edges around the cabinets. I got a sealant gun and just squeezed it into all the gaps. The trick with this is to get your fingers wet before running it along to smooth over the joins. The gun does just continually spew sealant, so this is a super messy job and I got through goodness knows how much kitchen roll. So I'd recommend trying to do this all in one go to just minimise the mess. At this point, I also screwed the plug sockets back in and just used a little extra bit of sealant to cover any gaps where my tile cuts were not quite perfect. Final thing is to clean all the grout off of literally everything. The grout leaves this sort of chalky residue everywhere, and so this needs to be wiped down off the tiles. I also still had a ton of adhesive stuck to everything, and my silly little trick with this was to use a fish slice to get it off, because you could scrape it without damaging the tiles or the kitchen side. It actually never crossed my mind until right now that I could have protected or covered my kitchen worktop while I was doing this, so maybe if you give this a go, that might be worth thinking about at the start. Finally, of course, there was also me to sort out, because at this point I was like 90% tile adhesive, grout, sealant, everything. I was an absolute state and I just could not wait to look and feel a little bit human again. I can't quite believe that it's finished. If you'd have asked me a few weeks ago, I would have never believed that I could tile this whole kitchen all by myself with no experience. It was the steepest learning curve in the world, but it gives me so much joy and pride to look around and know that I laid every single one of those tiles. You absolutely can't beat that feeling of knowing you've created something You've got all these new skills and you've saved however much money a professional would have cost you. It might not be perfect, but somebody recently said to me that if you get someone in to do these jobs, they're going to make mistakes too, and you're paying them to make them. So you might as well give it a go, make those mistakes yourself, and save yourself some cash in the process. I love that. Over the last few weeks, I've learned to cut tiles, lay tiles, grout, seal, and just push through when things get hard. I'm also the proud owner of a monster tile cutter and a rather impressive saw collection. It was a big old project, but it didn't take as long as I thought it might. I took about 4 weeks to complete it, in evenings after work. Would I do it again? Absolutely. I think the biggest challenge was really the learning curve. And now I know what I'm doing, I feel a lot more confident to take on something similar again. However, I think I need a good break before I pick up that tile adhesive. I'm so ready to not be filthy for a little while. To catch up on the first steps of this room, check out my tiling vlogs. Or to find out a bit more about the colour scheme I've put together for this space, have a look at my video on my colourful kitchen plans. I'm now moving on to the dining end of this room, so the colourful transformations are not quite done yet. Thanks so much for joining me on my tiling adventure. Make sure you're subscribed and let's catch up soon for more colourful home updates and honest DIY challenges. Bye for now.